Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. This week I want to cover the topic of who are the Anglo-Irish of the 15th century. I did a short on it a few times, and every single time I cover the topic of the Anglo-Irish, I get more and more questions on the identity of who are these people during the 15th century in Ireland. So I decided I would just make one video just to cover as much information on the Anglo-Irish as possible, just the basic information. And that way, next time when I get further questions on the topic, I, or yourself perhaps, can show them this video to explain who are the Anglo-Irish in the 15th century. The Anglo-Irish of the 15th century were descendants of the Anglo-Normans and the Cambro-Normans, who settled in Ireland following the Norman invasion of 1169. By the 1400s, they had established their own unique identity, which was a blend of Norman, English, and Irish elements. They were mostly centralised in the areas like the Pale, around Dublin, parts of Munster, Leinster, and along the eastern seaboard. Their power was based on a network of fortified towns, castles, and landed estates governed by a feudal law. However, over time, they would increasingly adapt aspects of Gaelic Irish culture and practices. Foremost, when people see the word Anglo-Irish, they either identify it with the word Anglo-Irish from the 13th century, which mostly applies Henry III's English lords or barons in Ireland, the Anglo-Irish, also referred to in the 13th century as the Hiberno-Normans. Or people apply the 17th century version of Anglo-Irish to the 15th century word Anglo-Irish. And worse still, people also apply the word Anglo-Irish from 1922. However, I'm afraid that you should not use modern nationalism when applying the word Anglo-Irish to the 15th century understanding of the word. Why modern nationalism doesn't apply to the Anglo-Irish of the 15th century? Modern nationalism is rooted in the idea of centralised nationalist states, shared ethnic ideas, and singular cultural identity. In the 15th century Ireland, these concepts did not exist. Politically and cultural identity were far more fluid and local. For the Anglo-Irish in the 15th century, identity was tied to land, kingship, and alliances rather than a unified nation. Using modern nationalism, such as the word Anglo-Irish in 1922, disturbs the idea of the role and motivations and even the relationships these Anglo-Irish would have had in the reality of medieval political politics at the time, further causing doubt to our understanding of what exactly is happening for the Anglo-Irish, who are a people between the English realm and the Gaelic, the native Irish realm. To further understand exactly what is going on in the 15th century, it is best not to apply modern nationalism into 15th century Ireland. Let's be pretty blunt here. No one in Ireland in the 15th century, both the English living in the Pale, the Anglo-Irish living between the two worlds, and the Gaelic clans had no form of understanding of what modern nationalism was, and had no concept of a unification under one tricolour flag. For the past few weeks, I've been asked why I use the term Anglo-Irish rather than the term Hiberno-Norman when talking about the 15th century. Why the Hiberno-Norman is inaccurate in the 15th century. The term Hiberno-Norman primarily describes the internal waves of settlers and descendants in the 12th and 13th century. By the 15th century, the Anglo-Normans had diverged significantly, with many families becoming Gaelicized, adopting Irish customs, language, and alliances. The term fails to capture the dual identity of the Anglo-Irish in this late period, and often acted as an intermediate between the Gaelic Irish and the English authorities. culture and dress of the Anglo-Irish cultures in the 15th century reflected the hybrid of identity, while maintaining aspects of the English culture, such as feudalism, lordship, and their chivalry ideas. They adopted many Gaelic customs, such as Brehon law, Irish laws, and also Irish dress around the Brehon law, and the fostering of Irish children among the Gaelic clans. Once again, to put it pretty bluntly, the reason why we refer to them as Anglo-Irish and not as Hiberno-Norman is that by the 15th century, almost 300 years after the Cambro-Norman and Anglo-Norman invasions of Ireland, by this point the Anglo-Irish had been living between the English realm and the Irish, the Gaelic Irish realm, causing them to fuse between the two, and they also have no connections with Normandy by the 15th century. So to refer to them as Hiberno-Norman would be quite misleading, and I feel, with many academics, that Anglo-Irish for the 15th century is a much better word to be using. How did the Anglo-Irish dress? The Anglo-Irish nobles wore a mix of European-style clothing, doublets, gowns, and hose, and the Irish style, like the lena, the long tunic, and also a brat, a woolen cloak. These choices reflected the degree of the Gaelic influence in the region. Let's talk about the development of Anglo-Irish armour. When the Anglo-Normans and the Cambro-Normans first appear in Ireland around 1169 for the Cambro-Normans and 1171 for the Anglo-Normans, they are dressed like this: a nasal helmet, riveted mail, kite shield, and sword. They are also mounted horsemen, which is very different to the Ridera, the Irish knights. However, straight from the get-go, we start to get away from the Norman period as we quickly enter into a new world of barons fighting barons from Ireland all the way to Germany. In this period, we start to see the development from the Normans into more European style armour. Here we can see straight away that we see more coat of arms, a change in shield to the heater shield, and a change to the greater helmet. There is a massive development and change that happens right away, both socially and in dress. This continues the development as we enter into the Scottish War of Independence, and then finally into the 100 Years' War. By the time we refer to them as the Anglo-Irish, much has changed, as much of the Anglo-Irish politically has been dividing away from England, and they have also been fighting in France against people that identify as Normans from Normandy. At this point, as I have previously discussed with the Knightly Lady, we start to see the Cherbourg armour in literature and depictions in books of the period. The Cherbourg armour is a massive development into full plate armour. As you can see, there is a development phase from the Hiberno-Normans all the way to the Anglo-Irish, which can be seen both in the literature and the depictions. We can see a development. They also continue developing through the 15th century, from the Cherbourg armour branching off to the Anglo-Irish armour that we can see in effigies throughout the country. It is interesting because most Anglo-Irish would also still take part in campaigns in the Wars of the Roses, meaning they would have had many different forms of armour, just like their English and French counterparts. However, what is very interesting is the fact that they choose to be depicted in their Anglo-Irish armour, choosing to have effigies of their Anglo-Irish armour on top of their tombs, sometimes even depicted next to their loved one. This wasn't the only impact. Language, for example, many Anglo-Irish nobles were bilingual, speaking both Middle English in official contexts and Irish in local affairs. The Butlers and the Fitzgeralds were two of the most prominent Anglo-Irish families in Ireland. The Butlers of Ormond and the Fitzgeralds of Kildare and Kerry. These families played central roles in Irish politics, often manoeuvring between the English and Gaelic spheres of influence. The Butlers centred in Kilkenny and Tipperary. They were huge allies to the Lancastrian family in England. The Butlers were connected to both the English and Gaelic families through marriages. For example, members of the Butler family married into the MacMora and other prominent Gaelic families to secure alliances around the island. The Fitzgeralds, later known as the Geraldines, they were based in Kildare and also in Munster-Desmond territory. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare became the de facto rulers of Ireland through their office of the Lord Deputy, also known as the Great Earls of Ireland. They married into Gaelic Irish families like the O'Connors and the O'Neills, while also maintaining ties with English families, such as the Yorks. So why marry into both Gaelic and English families in the 15th century? Marriage was a significant tool for both the Anglo-Irish and their Gaelic allies. Marrying into Gaelic families secured military support, local loyalty, and access to lands beyond the Pale. It also heightened their acceptance into Gaelic culture. Securing marriage alliances and taking hostages dominated their control around the island. Secondly, why the English connection? Marriages with English and European families strengthened their ties to a wider European world. These alliances reflected the Anglo-Irish families' status as legitimate members of nobility, giving them access to overseas trade networks, diplomacy support, and protection from families outside of Ireland during periods of political tension in Ireland and abroad. So that's pretty much my explanation of why I use the term Anglo-Irish in the 15th century and why I feel the term Hiberno-Norman is actually incorrect when having this conversation. I don't mind what term you would like to use, however, I do find it confusing when you say Hiberno-Norman. I also feel that a lot of people get very red-headed when I use the word Anglo-Irish, in particular highlighting the fact that I use the word Anglo. The reason why I use Anglo is because they are in between the English realm and the Irish realm, with no connections to Normandy, as I've said before. This isn't a reflection of the understanding of the word Anglo-Irish that we have from the 17th or from the 21st century. These understanding and concepts do not reflect the 15th century, remembering that the 15th century is a period of Joan of Arc and Henry V, who, although just like the Fitzgeralds, are starting to get a sense of nationalism with the Irish Parliament. This does not reflect our mindset at the time, and it would be a lie for you to apply modern nationalism to 15th century Ireland. So although it's important to study the development of the Irish Parliament, it's best not to apply our understanding of the 21st century into the 15th century. I also noticed that a lot of people were applying genetics when talking about the word Anglo-Irish in 15th century. I never talked about genetics, and genetics does not reflect the identity of people in the 15th century to the degree that people are trying to make out. If you're going to use the word Hiberno-Norman, why not use the word Hiberno-Scandinavian? These people are diverse at this period. For example, the Fitzgeralds consider themselves not Normans, believe it or not, but actually see themselves as Florentine and also have a trade connection with Florence at the time. So even from this period, it's difficult to disagree with their idea that they're Florentines and not Normans, although I myself would agree that they are Normans. I had many people in the comments section deny the fact that the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers or any Norman family at this point were married into English or had any form of English genetics, when that's not true. The second wave quite literally are referred to as Anglo-Normans, and there were also plenty Cambro-Normans who had married into and made alliances with English. So That's not entirely true. And even after the invasion of Ireland by the Cambro-Normans continue marrying into English in England. So the idea that they have no Anglo DNA is not true. But as I was saying before, at this point, the Anglo-Irish have many genetic backgrounds from Iberia, France, Scotland, England, throughout Ireland, Iceland even. The connections are a lot at this point. So to turn around and just highlight their Hiberno-Norman genetics and then justify that when they have no connections at that point with Normandy is quite strange. And furthermore, it also makes the conversation much more complicated because the war between France and England is ongoing, the 100 Years' War. There's never any peace agreement that's settled in the 15th century. It's not until much later on that finally there is peace between France and England. So even during the period of the War of the Roses, technically France and England are still at war with each other. And Normandy, for the most part, is connected to France. So with the Anglo-Irish constantly being mercenaries for the English in France, it makes the conversation much more complicated. And if you're talking to any academics or historians on the continent of Europe and you bring up the word Hiberno-Norman, they'll ask straight away, what is the connection between the Hiberno-Normans and the Normans of Normandy? And quickly, any historian from the continent of Europe will quickly sweep your feet because that's 300 years ago. If you turn around and say there's any connections 300 years later, you know, you're really chancing your arm and you're making the conversation much more complicated when it's just easier to refer to them as either Irish barons or as Anglo-Irish. Last but not least, what did these people refer to themselves as in the 15th century? Well, according to the Gaelic that lived in the northwest of the country, they were referred to as foreigners. However, there is a difference between the English. They quite literally called the English, but they called the Anglo-Irish foreigners. So you can see, even the way that they write, there's a distinction between the foreigners and the English. Even when you have English militaries marching around Ireland, they outright call the Anglo-Irish foreign militaries and foreign powers, and they call the English militaries an English power in Ireland. So you can see straight away there is a distinction between the foreigners and the English. However, on the flip side, the Anglo-Irish themselves do actually call themselves Irish. They're not calling themselves Irish because they're native Irish. They're calling themselves Irish because they're born in Ireland. You see that as well with the Ustamen up in the Icelandic sagas. The Icelanders call the Hiberno-Scandinavians, the Ustamen, the Irish Vikings, Irish in the Icelandic sagas, not because they're natives of the island, but because they are born in Ireland. Irish people born in Ireland. And there is a difference between the Gael, because the Gael, the native Irish, are quite literally referred to as the Gael, native Irish people. My ultimate point being, at this point, the Anglo-Irish, no one refers to them or even identifies them as Normans from Normandy. At that point, it would just make no sense by the time you're talking about the 100 Years' War, when there's absolutely no connection. Like, they're not going back to Normandy and going, oh, this is our fellow brethren. There's just no connection there. So anyway, I hope this video explains who are the Anglo-Irish and that we have a better understanding of that. If you have any more questions on the topic, please comment below. I would enjoy a further wide discussion. If you're going to disagree with me, please do it in an intelligent manner. I'm sick of going into the comment section where someone's going red-headed, and instead of, okay, finding fine points or turning around and saying, oh, well, I need further reading because I am stupid. Well, if I need finer reading, like where am I supposed to read from? Because all the academic books I have in the 15th century, highlighting once again, I am not talking about the 13th century, not talking about the 11th century, I'm talking about the 15th century. And every single book to do with the 15th century refers to them as the Anglo-Irish. If you have any books that counteract what I am saying, please reference what they are, rather than referring to me as dumb or ignorant. That's pretty much all I wanted to cover, was people who wanted a wider understanding of the word Anglo-Irish, or disagreed with why I was using the term Anglo-Irish. And I hope this video gave us a larger understanding of the term Anglo-Irish in the 15th century. Anyway guys, all the best, Slán go bhfuilne.